Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 7 of our reading of Alfred Hitchcock Presents Stories Not for the Nervous. And specifically, we will be reading Levitation by Joseph Payne Brennan. But first, we're going to go over the copyright information, which will be on your screen right now, and I'm finding it in the book. Says the author gratefully acknowledges the invaluable assistance of Robert Arthur in the preparation of this volume, and as you can see, this has all the copyright information. I'm not going to read it aloud, but it'll be on the screen. Something else that's going to be on the screen is this. This is the acknowledgments. I'm not going to read the acknowledgments aloud, but they will be here throughout the story. So anyway, let's get started. In the last part, the hypnotist caused a defiant person to levitate, seemingly, without physical aid, and then he collapsed motionless. So we're going to see what happened with that. There was a call for a doctor. The barker in the checkered suit appeared out of the tent and bent down the motionless form. He felt for a pulse, shook his head, and straightened up. Someone offered a bottle of whiskey, but he merely shrugged. Suddenly, a woman in the crowd screamed. Everyone turned and looked at her, and a second later followed the direction of her gaze. Immediately there was further cries, for the young man whom the hypnotist had put to sleep was still ascending. While the crowd's attention had been distracted by the fatal collapse of the hypnotist, he had continued to rise. He was now a good 7 feet above the platform and moving inexorably upward. Even after the death of the hypnotist, he continued to obey the final ringing command, "Rise." The barker, eyes all but popping out of his head, made a frantic upward leap, and he was too short. But he was too short. His fingers barely brushed against the moving figure above, and he fell heavily back to the platform. The rigid form of the young man continued to float upward, as if he were being hoisted by some kind of invisible pulley. Women began screaming hysterically. Men shouted, but no one knew what to do. A look of terror crept over the face of the barker as he stared up. Once he glanced wildly forward. He glanced wildly toward the sprawling shape of the hypnotist. "Calm down, Frank, calm down," the crowd shrieked. "Frank, wake up. Come down. Stop, Frank." But the rigid form of Frank moved ever upward, up until he was level with the top of the carnival tent, until he reached the height of the tallest trees, until he passed the trees and moved on into the soft moonlit sky of early October. Many in the crowd threw hands over horror-stricken faces and turned away. Those who continued to stare saw the floating form ascend into the sky until it was no more than a tiny speck, like a little cinder drifting far up near the moon. Then it disappeared altogether. I guess that's all for this story. I guess I could finish that up. I didn't realize it was that short. So anyways, on to the next story. Okay. Miss Winters and the Wind by Christine Noble Govan. Miss Winters stood on the corner with her bus. Miss Winters stood on the corner with her bus transfer held tightly in her hand and hated the wind. There had been a feud between Miss Winters and the wind for all the years that she had lived in this flat, dreadful city. It seemed to pick her out, a lone, forlorn little figure, to vent its nearly playful vindictiveness upon. It pulled at her droopy felt hat and whipped her saggy hair about her face, grabbing up her skirt in bawdy mischief, exposing her black cotton stockings. Once, when she had been coming home from her work, it had snatched the transfer from her hand and blown it under the passing bus. When the bus was gone, Miss Winters had peered through the dusk, searching everywhere, but the bit of yellow paper eluded her. People crowding around her had almost pushed her under a truck and had sworn at her impatiently. It had been the day before payday, and she had only the fare back to work in the morning. She had to walk the rest of the way home, 3 miles, and all against the wind. When she had lived in the South as a child, the wind had been a lovesome thing. The mountains kept it properly in hand and broke it as one breaks a mettlesome colt. It blew against the mountain tops and was parted into bits by the trees, which rolled and hummed with the sound like the sea. Over the fields, wild broom swept gently, making them rippling molten seas of red gold. Liquid beauty. In school, when she read Hiawatha, she narrow face lighted momentarily at the lines as the sunshine gleams and ripples that the cold wind makes in rivers. She had not known what a cold wind really was. But now she knew it was what seeped in at the ledges and made her feel numb. In spite of the fire she so assiduously tended, it got into bed with her at night, that even her striped cat, which crept under the covers, shivered, getting up all through the cold, black hours to turn his aching bones and seek to warm another surface. It blew through her worn coat and crept into the jagged hole in her flannel bloomers, where she had snagged them on the worn clothesline. On the wire clothesline on the roof. It tore at her fingers and their patched gloves until they burned in an agony of freezing. Her mother had come from this unspeakable section, and after Mr. Winter's father had died, the old lady had yearned to come home. The wind had been too much for her. Miss Winters remembered the grim satisfaction 2 seasons of it, and the old lady had been carried off with pleurisy. Miss Winters had had a fairly comfortable business then. She did fine and fancy sewing, prices reasonable. A flat-chested spinster whose maidenly longings had turned to a black ash years before. She made babies' frocks with minute embroidery yokes as delicate as frost, bridal gowns, and perky pinafores for chubby little girls. Her mother's illness and death was an expense. The depression came. She moved to meaner quarters evidently coveted by the wind, since it came in at every opportunity. She was lonely and anxious, and sometimes afraid. Fear clutched at her throat like an actual hand, making it difficult to swallow. Then the WPA gave her sewing to do. She made thick sacks and heavy work garments. Her hands grew stiff and raw at the clumsy work, and she thought of the women she had draped in silk and crepe de chine, of the flounced embroideries of her girlhood. The worst blow came when the project was closed. Women wore slacks and worked in factories and brought ready-made things. They had no time to try on Miss Winter's meticulously fashioned garments. Her old customers died or went to Florida, where the wind was less bitter. Mr. Winter's fright crept over her like a slowly rising tide. The hands which had once fashioned sprays of lilies of the valley, on batiste and lawn, had grown arthritic with the cold and with coarse work. All she could get was mending now, and occasional work in an alteration shop. The bus was crowded, and Miss Winters had to stand on the street in which she lived. The cold had killed even the smell of garlic and cabbage, but the wind was there, blowing the papers about, sending smoke and dust into her face, and tugging at her hat until her eyes filled with tears of vexation. She had 2 flights of stairs to climb before she got to her room. The cat was there waiting, curled up in the middle of the bed. He jumped down, stretching his lanky, striped body, and called to her, the only creature left who greeted her as a friend. With the cat, she could sometimes forget the clutching fear. Her confidence in her His confidence in her gave her a meager courage and determination, yet she feared for him, too. So many people were unkind to cats, especially if they were homeless. Was he lonesome, Mother's Boofoo pussycat? She asked through chapped lips. Mother'll build 'em's a fire, muzzle 'em, feed 'em. The cat, as if in appreciation of sudden oblivious idiotic devotion, writhed against her skirt and purred. Miss Winters, still gloved, laid the sticks and the precious bits of coal in the ashy grate and set a match to them. The darned wind came down the chimney and blew out the flame, scattering ash over the hearth and over her desperately polished shoes. At last she got the fire burning feebly. She set a pan of water on the gas ring for tea. While it heated, she sat in the deep-bottomed rocker before the hearth, her legs spread comfortably, her hands folded against her body for warmth. The cat jumped on her lap, nudging her with determined silken buddings under the chin, and she put her arm around him gratefully. He was something alive in the bare room, something to make her forget a little the rising tide of her fright. The rent. It took all she made at the shop. There was the 37 cents due the milkman, her shoe soles. The fear was always there. Haunted by it, she had bungled a garment at the alteration shop and had nearly lost her day's work there. Cold that was not from the wind filled her at the memory. The cat stood on his legs, purring and sidling his velvety nose against her face, making a winning sound that was both a purr and a mew. In a sudden burst of tenderness, she hugged him to her, and he stared up at her smugly, his eyes green moons with mysterious golden crevices in them. She jumped up and made the tea, pouring a little milk from a can and some of the hot water into a saucer for the cat. From her purse she took a chop bone she had wheedled from one of her fellow workers. It was a sliver of meat upon it, and gave forth an enticing fragrance of pepper and fried flesh. She pulled the meat off, looked about the bare room shamefaced, and ate it slowly, tears of self-pity welling for a moment in her eyes. Then she stooped and set the bone with its ruffle of cold suet by the cat's saucer. The cat left the milk and began to gnaw fastidiously at the suet, the tip of his tail curling in and out with satisfaction. Miss Winters took off her hat and drank her tea. She sat and sipped it, and watched the cat, savoring the beauty of his gaunt grace and the wonder of his green and depthless eyes. The wind was rising. The wind grew colder and colder as the darkness deepened. Miss Winters took off her outer garments and brought her flannel gown and heated it by the fire. She heated more water and filled a fruit jar to sip between the frigid sheets. Then, armed with the cat and the jar, and banking the meager coals to hold the heat as long as possible, she crept into bed. The spotted bulb beside her bed gave scarce enough light to read the sensational love story magazine with which she escaped into forgetfulness each night. Hours later, she was awakened. The wind not content to torment her by day, was making every wakeful hour a misery and a threat, must arouse her by night and bring her back to the grim knowledge from which, in her dreams, she had a brief escape. It howled around the chimney. It battered the windows so that they rattled in their frame. The window that Miss Winters had patched with a wide patch of butcher's paper seemed to bulge as if at any moment it would burst and hurtle across the room. Something blew down on the roof and continued to rattle and bounce, making it impossible to sleep. The cold seemed a tangible thing, raking her spine, nipping her face, pinching at her feet, where the already chilly fruit jar mocked any idea of comfort. She turned on the light and thought it might warm her. The cat crawled out and moved nervously about the bed. Then came a peculiar, vicious gust of wind. It screamed and threw itself at the cracked window. The glass ripped apart and was scattered like shrapnel. The cat leaped from the bed, meeting a spear of glass in midair. He gave a scream and dropped wearily over the yellowish matted rug. The yellowish matting rug. The bright splashes of his blood were blown like the petals of a rose. Miss Winters rose from the intricate wrappings of the bed. She was cold, but with the cold of insensate fury. She went across the broken glass and picked up the limp body. The lovely green eyes were glazed, and the blood dripped in warm splotches on her stockinged feet. She stood there for a long time. At last she laid the cat down and said absently, "This has gone far enough." She knew at last what she must do, and consequently she felt calm. Going to the bed, she ripped off the covers, the coat she wore in the daytime, the quilt that was made of all the velvet and silks of her happier days. She got the sheet, a huge patched affair, and she shook it out, looking at it thoughtfully. It was so clear, so simple, that she wondered she had not thought of it before. She must catch the wind and tie it firmly in something so that never again could it get away, frightening and harassing poor old women, keeping them awake so the knowledge of their misery, killing their cats. She put on her shoes and, without giving the cat another look, opened the door and began to walk resolutely down the stairs. "Who has seen the wind?" she sang in the treble of her childhood, as the wind tore at her long flannel gown and tried to take the sheet away from her. "Ha ha!" she chuckled, holding the sheet closer to her. "Not this time, my fine friend, not this time. Who has seen the wind? Where does the wind go? Up high, high in the sky." She looked at the church steeple. It was the highest thing in sight. It shone there even on this dark night, a dull, gleaming spear. A spear had killed her cat. The wind had a spear. She would kill the wind. QED, she chuckled from some forgotten pigeonhole. You got at the tower the tower of the church through a little door in the rear, as she had expected. It was not locked, and without hesitation she began her purposeful ascent, up and up, around and around, tripping over the sheet, stepping on the hem of her gown, stumbling, laughing, and going on again. There was no wind inside the tower, but she was not deceived. It was waiting for her at the top, and she was waiting for it. At last she reached the little room where the chimes were, a square room with open Gothic arches and a balcony off to one side. The wind was there. She expected, ramping and growling about like a lion, but she was no longer afraid of it. "We shall see," she crooned happily. "We shall see." She shook out the sheet. Of course, the wind tried to take it, but she caught the four corners together skillfully and stepped out on the little ledge. The lights in the town glimmered and twinkled far below. She looked at them placidly, and if to say, "Just watch me. I'm fixing this devilish fellow once and for all." Just then the wind came at her. It gave a swoop rather, and she caught it in the sheet, which billowed like a huge loaf of rising bread. She had to leap to get it, but she had it there. She was so happy, so relieved, she felt as though she were simply walking on air. She looked down at the lights rushing towards her. She had one icy moment before she died. One moment in which she knew that the wind had won. Okay, that was a short story. Let's go on to the next one. Next we have The Dog Died First by Bruno Fischer. Blood was on my mind that night, but it was blood of the French Revolution. I was correcting modern European history papers when Dot was at a hen party at Marley Canton's. At midnight, I went to bed knowing that between bridge and chit-chat there was no telling when Dot would be home. The sound of the car pulling into the driveway woke me. As we have no garage in our bungalow-type stucco house, we leave the car out in the open on the cinder driveway. I heard Dot enter the house through the back door, and then I was listening to water running in the kitchen. It ran for a long time, too long for her to be getting a drink, and she certainly wouldn't be washing herself at the kitchen sink. Drowsily, I wondered what she was up to now, and I wondered a lot more when she turned off the water and left the house again. The radium clock on the dresser said 5 minutes after 1. I turned on my side and looked through the window. Dot had left the car's headlights on, and she was walking into their glare. The pail she carried in her right hand, was evidently full of water. The weight of it made her neat hips sway. She opened the black sedan door, switched on the overhead light, dug a dripping scrub brush out of the pail, and leaned inside the car. So that explains her antics. No doubt someone had spilled liquid on the upholstery and she was trying to scrub it off before it dried. I dug my head into the pillow to shut out the glow of the headlights coming in through the window. I was almost asleep when the night lamp went on in the bedroom. "Are you awake, darling?" Dot asked. I mumbled, turning my head to let her know that I was too sleepy for conversation. But nothing ever stopped Dot from talking. My desire for slumber didn't. I'd trained myself to absorb her chatter without listening to it, and that's what I did then until a starting sentence jerked me awake. "I couldn't get all the blood off," she had said. "Blood?" I breathed, opening my eyes wide. "Did you say blood?" Dot was taking a nightgown out of the drawer. "He died on the way to the doctor," she said complacently. "I feel like a murderer." She straightened up with the nightgown in her hand. The soft, dim nightlight played over her tightly and precisely formed body, and her face was as guileless as a doll's. "Who died?" I demanded hoarsely. "The dog, of course," she said, dropping the nightgown over her head. I sank back into bed. A dog, of course. Well, what had I really expected? "I wasn't going to tell you because you're always criticizing my driving," she exclaimed, "like when I smashed a fender last week. But I really couldn't help what happened tonight. The dog ran right under the wheel. Then when I got home, I noticed the blood on the car and I tried to wash it off. But I couldn't quite because it had dried. I decided to tell you because you'll see it tomorrow." I was drowsy again, but puzzled. How does blood get inside a car when you run over a dog? He was still breathing, so I took him to the vet, but he was dead when I got there. The dog, I mean. The poor little thing. She put out the light and got into bed, but that didn't stop her voice. She told me about the $1.17 she had lost at bridge, and that Ida Walker looked dowdy, and Marie Cannon stunning, and Edith Bauer. How about some sleep? I complained. She was quiet for about a minute. It seemed to me that she was shaking me. Bernie, she whispered, there's somebody sneaking around outside with a flashlight. The radium clock said 10 minutes after 3, which meant that I'd actually been asleep for about 2 hours. Dot was sitting up and past the vague outline of her shoulder, and through the window I saw a splotch of light move along the side of the car. Maybe he's trying to steal the car, she whispered. Did you leave the key in the ignition? It didn't surprise me when she admitted that she thought she had. Snorting, I got out of bed and went to the window. Whoever held the flashlight seemed to have lost interest in the car and was walking towards the street. He's going away, I said hopefully. I was a man who liked to avoid trouble. I wonder what he wanted. I know what I want, I said. Sleep. I had one leg on the bed when the doorbell rang. I froze, half on the bed, listening. There are few things more disturbing than a doorbell ringing at 3 a.m. That must be the thief, Dot whispered. I roused myself. Thieves don't ring doorbells. Well, it's somebody, Dot pointed out. It certainly was somebody. The doorbell kept on ringing. I fumbled into slippers and robe, went into the living room, turned on the light, opened the front door. The man who entered held a flashlight in his hand, and he was the same one I had seen prowling outside. He had more paunch than chest and a lumpy face. Okay, we have been reading. Okay, I'm going to have to go through all these. We finished off Levitation. We read, Levitation was by Joseph Payne Brennan. We read Miss Winters and the Wind by Christine Noble Govan. And we are reading The Dog Died First by Bruno Fischer. And we have been reading, actually, Alfred Hitchcock Presents Stories Not for the Nervous. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, all the information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.